Afternoon, everybody. We're going to be starting the webinar in just a couple of minutes. Apologies, we've had a few technical issues our end. We should be getting going as soon as possible. Everybody will get the recording anyway if you've got to drop off. Apologies. Apologies if you've got other things scheduled in your diary. Everybody will get a recording of the webinar anyway. We're going to get going now. Apologies again for any inconvenience that may have caused. So usual webinar platform info, any questions can be in the questions tab. We will be dropping various stuff in the chat tab as well. I'm going to, when people are presenting, my colleague Paul and Ali may be able to drop some of the links from the presentation in the chat. Everybody's in listen only. Webinar resources and a CPD certificate will be sent out to all attendees following today. So without further ado, again, apologies for any inconvenience. We're going to get going with the webinar. So just who's on today's webinar? We've got Paul Brown, Technical Advisor Construction, myself, Rob Mallender, Technical Advisor for Building Services, Alison Whittle, Technical Advisor Post 16, and Mark Jones is not supporting us today. We've got Graham Hyatt supporting us from EAL, but we can contact Mark through the details on screen if need be after today's event. So everybody's contact details will be on the slide if you've got any follow-up questions if we can't pick anything up today. So what we're going to be looking at, obviously we've looked at introductions. Basically today is core exam overview, hints and tips, what's in the examiner's comments and reports, and then we're going to be looking at the employer set project as well. Again, an overview, what went well, what went not so well, hints and tips, examiner's comments, structure of assessments and AO processes and assessment delivery, grading, etc. That was all covered in previous webinars. So, you know, if the autumn series is maybe not your first series and you need to get a bit of background on that type of thing, the links are on the slide there. We'll try and drop them in the chat at some point today. But those webinars are on our T-level page as well on the City and Guilds website. It's crucial, really, if this is not your first series and exam and you're dropping in for interest, you watch those webinars which were previous to this one. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ali, who's going to start and pick up some of the BSE OSC material.
Hello everyone. Yeah, huge apologies because of technical difficulties. So I'm going to crack on as quickly as I can. So in this first section, I'm going to be providing a high-level overview of the core theory exams, with a particular focus on the examiner's reports for some of the weaker areas and really picking out what will help you in preparing for the autumn exams. Thanks, Rob. Right, so I've basically taken a general shot of both of the papers from BSc and on-site construction. So I'm just going to give you a very high level over here. So in papers 1, which was your first paper 1 of the theory exams for both BSc and on-site, both sectors performed higher on paper 1. And the examiner commented that the short answer questions, which remember when we went through related to the assessment objectives of AO1A and AO1B, were in the main answered well, which meant that learners were, very good on demonstrating their recall of knowledge and were able to respond accurately to command verbs and questions that started or with a state, a list, identify, or a name type answer. And of course, they're the shorter answer questions at the beginning of the paper with the lower marks. So, you know, they said overall it was better, and the majority of learners attempted every question. So what could be improved? So in general, part B of the paper, and that's where there are 3 extended response questions, the examiners struggled in a lot of cases to read the handwriting of some students. And when they did answer the extended response question, in many cases, it wasn't contextualized to that scenario. So just to bring that to life to you. So for example, if the question asked about a listed building and what considerations were needed for planning applications, learners were able to write about planning applications, but actually didn't relate them to a listed building. So it wasn't contextualized. So just some hints there for you. So, you know, I've got some suggestions and some quick fixes for you for this one that you can share with your learners. So just to sort of give you a hint, as a general rule, the amount of white space on an exam paper is a good indication of the length of the response required. So in general, you know, if you look at 2 lines of space is provided for each mark. So, you know, that's just something you can take back. Some learners wrote with a black felt pen, and that bled through to the answers on the next page, which unfortunately made a lot of them illegible for the examiners to mark. So if you can just really make sure that your learners only write with a black or a blue ballpoint pen. Now, a lot of them said their handwriting was poor. So you know, it's not something that tutors can suddenly fix overnight, but a quick fix here is, you know, they can write in print or use capital letters for their responses if, you know, if that's easier for the examiner to read. So they haven't got to do joined up writing or, you know, sort of curvature writing if they don't need to. And we're going to really look at a lot of them struggled on AO2 command verbs and the types of responses required. And this is pretty critical, really, because the assessment objective 2, AO2, carries the most weighting and, again, the most marks. Thanks, Rob. So again, a very similar sort of layout. In paper 2, you know, the lower mark questions and assessment objectives of AO1A and AO2, AO1B were answered well. Again, you know, they generally, in both sectors, though, learners performed less well on paper 2 than they did on paper 1. So similar sort of scenario. So what could be improved? Now, this is obviously the science paper as well, where an examiner's commented that the maths in some cases was quite poor, and there was a lack of correct terminology when answering some of the questions. Now, that means terminology in industrial type terminology, and some of them randomly sort of use their own responses rather than sort of technical sort of wording. And it was also apparent in some cases that learners hadn't read the questions properly. For example, if a question was in 2 parts, they found that learners answered the first part, but actually lost and didn't answer the second part, which means that they lost the opportunity there for full marks. So some hints and tips for paper 2. And we're going to be revisiting some question types, and sort of we've got this in this webinar, that how you can respond or teach your learners to respond to a 2-part question type. And I think realistically, going back to terminology and things, if they're asking them to recall any legislation or any regulations, examiners will accept industry recognized abbreviations and acronyms, you know, as we've shown you in the marking scheme, to help with that terminology. So, you know, they can abbreviate and they can use, you know, the industry recognized sort of, you know, abbreviations for that. In a lot of cases in paper 2, the examiners said it was evident that some of the learners had run out of time and they hadn't managed to complete the paper. So coming from a teacher and examiner myself, you know, just do they have watchers? Because, you know, I know in exam situations, very few learners actually wear watchers because they tend to rely on their mobile phones, which obviously can't be taken into exams. So just a quick suggestion, either have a clock in the room or an invigilator providing some timing guidelines may help, because it's perfectly acceptable for an invigilator to say you have 30 minutes left on paper 1, you should now be thinking about moving on to part B. It's perfectly acceptable to do that as a recognised invigilator in that room. And just picking up in some cases here, it may be the case that in BSE particularly, that the guided learning hours are so much larger in the core than they are for the on-site, that learners maybe don't actually sit the first exam until this autumn series, which allows the tutors to provide full coverage of the core and teaching of the core. And if you require, you can use the spring series as a resit in year 2. So it's just about sort of working out, you know, if they haven't managed to cover the core, don't sit the exam series in spring, wait until the autumn. So that's entirely down to a centre, but just some suggestions there. Thanks, Rob. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag on this, I think, as we move towards it there. I should be seeing sort of ESP. Yes, I think I've got it now. That's great. Thank you. So some good news now, you know, in the ESP. So looking at that, you know, the learners all performed better in the ESP, and many learners gained close to full marks in the ESP. What the examiners reported is that it was consistent throughout both sections in the ESP, with BSE and on-site, with high achieving learners performing highly across the whole of the ESP. And it was a comparable situation with lower performing learners whose evidence was also consistent throughout. So that indicated that there's no significant differences in task difficulty distribution. So if I break that down and bring that to life, what this actually means is that a learner who would be considered a B grade performed a B grade throughout the ESP, and a learner who would be a D grade performed a D grade throughout the ESP, which obviously sort of supported that the tasks were of equal consistency and difficulty throughout. So I think what came across is as task 2.2, the evaluation. Overall, in particular, it was a good standard throughout. So that's a real positive. The only downside of that is it carries the least marks, only carries 8 marks in total. So, you know, did learners concentrate too much on that and not enough on where the higher marks were? So if you know what could be improved, I think that the report was a bit inconsistent, and I think what happened from the examiners when we interviewed the examiners, by the way, this wasn't taken from the brief, we interviewed the examiners and had a meeting with them, and what they were saying is a lot of the learners confused the research with the report and included what the report was in their research, thinking, well, I've already written this, so I don't really need to do it again. So we need to really drill down into that. And in task 1.3, where they should produce a project plan, there were some, although everybody did that, in some cases, the quality of those plans submitted were quite different, you know, from ranging from the top to sort of basic in some cases. So it just might be somewhere you can focus on working on Gantt charts. You can maybe look at how they can structure certain things together to sort of get, I know you can't provide a template, but you can sort of guide them down that way. Right, tasks 1.4 and 2.1, which were the presentation, the collaborative discussion. I think in many cases, it was the observation record that sort of didn't support that for every candidate, which is the tutor observation record. We have a template available for you, and you can work on that observation record now. And I think the hint is that they must be really detailed and contextualized for each learner. I think the examiners picked up that there was a lot of the same detail across many candidates, so they couldn't differentiate between the marking for those candidates. And a quick hints and tips, and I think, you know, if you were able to provide more support to your learners for the ESP. I think the examiner's comments were to suggest that tasks 1.2, the report, and task 1.3, which, was the plan, they're the areas of focus, as these tasks carry the most marks and the weightings. And for task 1.4, the presentation, we're going to be sharing some hints and tips of how to complete the observation record and support the presentation. So throughout this, we're going to be bringing, we're picking up on all these hints and tips as we go through each of the ESP tasks. So I've broken it down task by task. So moving on. So bringing all of this together, which is a huge amount when you look at 2 exam papers and an ESP, we've looked at 5 principal areas that we're going to concentrate on today, and we're going to be using some real examples of students' work, not samples. These are real live, and we can look at the marking. So looking at that slide, there was a clear differentiation. I don't know what's happened there we go, thank you. Just on, clear differentiation between when candidates were asked to demonstrate what does understanding, application, analysis or evaluation mean. So that was quite key. We know we need to really focus on supporting candidates with the ERQ, the extended response questions, as many candidates did underperformed in section B. Some candidates really found it challenging when they didn't understand how to respond to certain command verbs. And in the ERQ questions, if candidates were asked to sort of contextualize a question, and it was in the way it's worded, the questions sometimes were in parts, and of course they asked for explanation, discussion points, and the candidate's response sort of went off on a tangent, not addressing those questions fully, and they never access the higher marks that were available. And I think, looking at that, there is a significant difference between the type of response required by an explain type question than a describe type question. So I'm going to sort of be looking at some of these. So just to bring this to life again, this is what's coming. We're going to look at assessment objective AO2 and AO3, and we're going to unpick what the responses you should be encouraging your learners to give to command verbs that start with, obviously analyze, discuss, evaluate, and justify. We've got examples of extended response questions for you, and we're going to show you how to deconstruct those questions for learners. We've got samples of where a twofold question is and how you can pick that out and teach learners how to identify a 2-part question. And I'll be going through the unpicking the difference between explain and describe. Thanks, Rob. Sorry, I do feel like I'm sort of speaking fast, but I'm very happy for you to contact me, individually if you want me to sort of go through anything here. So this is, I'm going to go through the next 2 slides were from the last exam support webinar. And I'm really drilling down here how to look at ways of supporting learners in how they respond to these questions. And I'm going to be using examples from this slide. So AO2, it's going to be medium to high marks here. The high tariff questions, medium tariff questions. So it does require that learner to take the knowledge that they've got on the course and then not only understand it, it's apply it to a context or a scenario. So the question will give them a context or scenario. So they have to then look at how they're going to approach that. So you'll see things like the questions will start with, what is the best approach to in this situation? Explain the process procedure to take when, and what are the implications of? And that needs to be specific rather than generalized. So those are the type of questions that these command verbs start from. So if they don't understand these types of questions, they won't they're going to struggle to sort of, can you go back a slide, Rob? Just let me go back one to make sure I've got AO2 there. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so if learners don't understand the question, they will actually struggle to form a response really on this one. And they won't be able to access those higher marks. So we've provided examples later on which are contextualized to BSc, and on-site, really. So what is the difference? I'm still on slide 10, which is great. What is the difference between a describe question and an explain question? So, you know, you have all these academic explanations, but in real life, you know, as you're teaching this, if a question asks you to explain something, it wants them to say why something happens. Whereas if a question says describe, it wants you to say what happened. And that's a very slight difference, but it's huge, the difference in the answer responded. So explain means why, describe means what. So if I was to describe something, I would be given an account of something, and I'd give any details relating to what that something may be, what that scenario is. If I'm asked to explain something, I'd give an account of something and any details relating to it, with the goal of simplifying it to somebody or making it something easier to understand. So what is it and why? So it's a slightly different, you know, the response is different. They will get marks, obviously, but they're not going to access the higher marks unless they've explained fully, which is why. So I hope that makes some sense to you. Moving on to the next slide, please, Rob. This is now these questions are typically in your extended response questions. These are part B in both your papers, and it's the 3 extended response questions, and they do tend to start with, you know, there will be explaining it as well, but discuss, analyze, and you can see that evaluate and justify here. So you've got what these mean. So I'm just going to break them down slightly. So these types of questions expect a higher quality of response. They're always to do with the higher bands. Now, there's only 20% weighting in these, as opposed to, I think the previous slide had 45% weighting on AO2. So, you know, it is just the 9 to 12 mark questions, of which there are 3 of them in general. So if you were discussing, these are usually marked within bands as well. So you'll see bands 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that gives you an idea. So learners will always be able to access some of those marks. So an analyze type question is that learners will be given a complex or realistic occupationally scenario, and they'll be asked to analyze the consequences of. Now, if they don't know what consequences of means or analyze, they've got no chance of that question. So if you look at what analyze means, it means examine something methodically and in detail. So you look at something in detail and to try and explain and interpret it. And a consequence in simple terms means as a result of that action. So, you know, look at something in detail and what are the results of that, which means the consequence of. So analyze the situation and recommend an approach to be taken. This is a twofold question. Part 1 is analyze the situation. So that's what they'd do first. And part 2 of this question is then recommend an approach after you have analysed and examined it. So it's just to understand that, you know, you're going to have analysed this particular situation and recommend an approach. Everybody addressed the situation, but nobody recommended an approach after. So it's just splitting those down in 2. And another example, I think, is shown here, which is in, if you look at analyze how a situation can be managed, what does that mean? It means look at how you're going to do something in detail. That's what it means. And then the part 2 of this is in order to, because if you've seen this question here, is analyze how the situation can be managed in order to. So what does in order to means? It means how to achieve an end. So it's just breaking those down into simplified versions for those learners to really get into the detail. I completely understand that not all learners will be able to access this, but it's pushing those learners who possibly could. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rob now, who's going to be talking you through some BSE real life scenarios here. And okay, Rob.
Thanks a lot, Ali. Again, apologies everybody. Just give me 1 second just before I get going. I just need to just shut a couple of things down. which we've had open whilst we were getting set up. Again, apologies for any technical issues. Okay, colleagues, just confirm you can see the slides again, please.
I can, but you're not on full screen, Rob.
Okay, I'm on full screen my end. Just a minute.
Shall I try for you, Rob?
Is that full screen now?
No, I'll just try. No, you're on presentation mode. So if you go down to your icon there, you'll be able to do it there. Or I can put you, if you go back, because you can see your next slide. Yeah. I've put you in full screen, Rob. You're in full screen now.
Okay, you can see the slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. We just had a bit of a rush getting set up, and if I'd have not swapped things over, you'd have kept getting interrupted by my Outlook, which was still on because I didn't have a chance to turn it off. So apologies again for the technical issues. So yeah, as Ali said, we've used some now actual examples from the last series of exams. So this is a BAC example. I'm going to talk through some of the layout of this first. So not all questions cover one assessment objective. So as you can see at the top there, many questions cover various assessment objectives. So this question covered AO2 and AO3, which is why we're going through this one, because that's what Ali's just sort of run through with you. As well as learning outcomes, there can be multiple learning outcomes, which are there on the right-hand side of the slide, and maths and English digital skills can also be linked into one question. This is obviously cross-referenced to the course handbook. So all those test spec references on the right of the reports there are all cross-referenced to the course handbook. So what we've got here is an example of a heat loss calculation building services question where they was asked to calculate a very simple room calculation there. They was given the U values, and that was the first part of the question. So when we looked at the analysis for this, most learners had a go at that part of the question. They all had an attempt at the calculation. Obviously, not all got 100% of the calculation correct, but most were awarded some marks. If you look at the bit highlighted on the left-hand side of the screen, in this example, many learners didn't even attempt the last part of the question. So they were so maybe blinkered on that calculation. Once they'd done that calculation, they thought maybe, okay, that's that part of the question and is now complete. And as you can see at the bottom there, we've got an analysed question. So potentially quite a lot of marks allocated to that. You can see in the guidance on the right-hand side of the slide, obviously various band and marks are allocated to the calculation, but also how they've demonstrated the total heat loss and what they've recommended as an efficient method of space heating. So if they haven't done that part of the question, they would lose large marks for that question. So what we're going to do now, and Ali's going to probably jump in with me on this, we're going to just look through how we're going to deconstruct these questions when we're talking to candidates. So what we've done, we've took that question from the previous slide. So the top there, questions with the keywords highlighted, analyze the total heat loss based on the information provided and recommend an efficient method of space heating. And the words I've elaborated there are the words we've highlighted. So they're the key words the candidate should be picking out of that question when they deconstruct that question. So first, analyze. So as Ali said there, they're looking at the consequences of the analysis. They're looking at the consequences of that total heat load. And based on the information provided, they're going to then study them results of the heat loss calculation, look at the heat load, the building characteristics, and then they're going to suggest potential heat sources for that building. Now, there might be more than one solution for that. As long as the analysis is a good analysis, they should still get some marks for that, even though they've recommended maybe a heat source which the examiner might not quite agree with or something like that. So it's how they analyze that heat loss and the information provided to try and gauge as many marks as possible when they look at that part of the question. And then we broke it down further. So then we've highlighted the keyword recommend and then an efficient method of space heating. So there, they should be suggesting a suitable method of space heating, including detail as to why this will be effective. So we've not used the word efficient in there. So why will it be effective? Why will it be efficient? Why would you recommend that space heating? You know, it might be that the radiators, and you discuss, well, it's good because you'll get the airflow, convection currents, capable of heating the room well. Or it might be that you've seen that the type of room might not need, or might need quite a lot of wall space, and you might recommend underfloor heating, something like that. They have to then look at the scenario for the type of the room, so they can then deconstruct the question, look at the scenario, the type of building. I think in this case it was an outbuilding, such a wooden office type building. They've got to look at that, analyze the heat load, then recommend an efficient method of space heating. So there's quite a lot of parts to that question. And the candidates didn't attempt, then obviously a lot of marks lost. So we've used another BSc example. So this was an old house, new heating system installed, and basically a pre-inspection on the maintenance requirements of the heating system, electrical supply, etc. So basic knowledge of supplies to buildings. And the key bit there is highlighted again. The candidate's got to discuss the likely condition of the services within the building, including what approaches need to be taken to minimize disruption and safety. So we're going to look again on the next slide how we can deconstruct that question. So again, we've got the key words highlighted there. Discuss. We've got the verb there. The likely condition of the services within the building. So that might be the first part the candidate looks at. Discuss the likely condition of the services. Then break it down further. So they've looked at the services, they looked at maybe the heating system, the water supply, the electrical supply, and then what approaches need to be taken. So approaches, if we look at the bit there, approaches means a way of dealing with someone or something, a way of doing or thinking about such a problem or a task. So what approaches might you then take to minimize disruption, and maintain safety? So minimize disruption, lessen any problems for obviously the occupier, and maintain safely to keep an existing state. So to simplify that, we've really got 4 key areas. We've got to discuss the likely condition of the services, and then what approaches might be taken, but not only to minimize disruption, but to maintain safety for the people within the building maybe, or the building itself. So it's about looking at that question, deconstructing that question, and pulling out the key words so the candidate can then reflect on that and maximize marks. So if the question is broken down so learners can have a clear understanding, the extended response questions, they're worded in a certain way to differentiate between learners. So discuss the likely condition of the services within the building, what approaches need to be taken to minimize disruption and safety. Part 1, they're going to write about the condition of the services. Detail the different issues. We broke it down again. We're just running through how we broke this down. So then part 2, write about the different ways you deal with the problems. Is there a risk of disruption to people? The safety of people there whilst the work is being carried out. So it's about looking at the question, deconstructing it, and then approaching it in a certain amount of stages. And potentially this is how, potentially revision questions could be written, by looking at the exam questions, the extended response questions, and reconstructing those questions and letting candidates deconstruct them, and before potentially having a crack at answering the question. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who's going to look at a couple of examples for construction.
Right, thank you. Thanks for that, Rob. Hopefully you can all hear me. So what we're going to do, guys, is for on-site, we're just going to go through a couple of examples to put what Alison's previously mentioned into practice, so to speak. So you can see on this first slide, there's an extended response question where a lot of the marks are associated with it, as we've previously said. And this is sets a scenario. So the first part is a company's involved with the Ministry of Defence work. It's about ERR and induction around that. So the scenario is set for the questions that are going to be asked, as you can see in front of you. But then the questions themselves, it talks about discuss 3 subjects to be included in the training and why they are important to the construction industry. So this is a 2-part question. So you've got to discuss and you've got to explain why. So it's in 2 parts. And again, Alison's previously mentioned this, we found that some of the responses looked at the discuss aspect, but kind of forgot about the why bit. So again, marks, potentially lost. So it's a 2-part question. And again, it's about interpretation. So of the verb, so discuss. So it's about writing about a topic. In this case, it's the ERR contextualized there within the scenario I previously mentioned, in which they're considering different issues and ideas and opinions related to, the scenario in the question itself. And then you've got the why aspect. So the reasons, the explanation as to why they have chosen to discuss those particular 3 subject areas that they've chosen. So the 2 parts. And as you can see, these 12 marks are available. And the 9.11 is the assessment objective reference number. Again, all in a handbook, again, as Rob's mentioned previously. And then you've got the assessment objectives. And in this case, it's AO2, AO3A, and AO3B. And then for the markers, in order to give some guidance to them, you can see the indicative kind of content we're expected to see in the answers. I won't go through all these, but from the employment rights about wages, pensions, health and safety, welfare arrangements, and from the employee kind of responsibilities about confidentiality, working to contract. And as you can see, it also gives guidance to the market in terms of the expected response is to cover both employers and employee responsibilities, and, which is the second part of the question, an explanation of why for each of those. So that's the kind of standard layout of a question, with the marks, with the assessment objectives identified and the learning outcomes identified, and then just to give you some idea of the kind of content that the marker would use to start to allocate marks. So we could move over to the next slide, please, Rob. So what, we'll just click again, please. Yeah, lovely, thank you very much. So what we've got here is the extended response question bands for marking the marker's guidance. Now, as I stated earlier, it's out 12 marks. So you can see you've got AO2, AO3A, and AO3B. Each one of those has 4 marks applicable to each one. So there's 4 marks available. What you will hopefully notice is, in order to distinguish between, get some differentiation between the responses that are provided. As you can see on the left, it talks about basic. So if you look at the AO2, just as an example, and you can look at AO3, A and B at your leisure later, but just taking AO2, it talks about limited understanding. That's on the very first few words. And that's what we'd consider to be a basic kind of response. And then a good response would be some understanding of the question and related to its context. And then thorough is a range of accurate understanding. So again, as we go down, more marks are applicable. So for basic, 1 mark, good 2 mark, another mark, thorough would be another. So if it actually came out of thorough, then they get 3 potential marks. And then you've got comprehensive, which is a range of detailed and accurate understanding of responding to the question within the context that has been set. And then if you look across on your left hand side, you can see how that then aligns to the bands. So if you look there, you can see I've highlighted for band 1, which is 1 to 3 possible marks, then it talks about demonstrate a basic use of analysis. For band 2, 4 to 6 marks, a good use of analysis of the topic. Obviously, this is ERR, as we previously said. And then band 3, 7 to 9 marks, demonstrates a thorough use of analysis related to the topic. And then band 4, which is 10 to 12 marks, which is where you're going to get the higher marks, it's demonstrate comprehensive use of analysis. So that's the kind of criteria that we're working with in terms of the marking and the markers guidance. So the easiest way to kind of maybe put this to you is actually give you a work example. So if we go on to the actual next slide, please, Rob. So what we've got here is an actual candidate's response, and you can see this is the band 1 response. So it's anything from 1 to 3 marks, and in this case, they've got 3 marks. And you can see the response there. It's quite succinct, shall we say, what consists of 4 sentences to answer the whole question in terms of discussing and explain why. And as you can see there, you can probably materialize that, again, going back to the marking grids, that they've got 1 mark for AO2, 1 for AO3, and 1 for AO4. So, you know, they managed to get band 1, they've got the top of band 1, they've got 3 marks because of the response that they're given, which you can see in front of you. What is particularly of interest, though, is the examiner's commentary. So you can see that the examiner is saying that they've provided a basic analysis of the topics for ERR. They was asked to identify 3 subjects, but they actually only identified 2. So again, a potential loss of mark there. And the response was focused only on the employee and doesn't kind of consider the employer aspect of things. And again, if you remember, I mentioned in the assessor's guidance, then that's what they would be looking to see in the learner's responses. And it talks about a basic application of knowledge and failed to use any of the context given in the questions. They didn't actually relate this to the fact that it was with the Ministry of Defence in this particular example. And also about, it was general comments about EIR rather than it being applied to the specific scenario that was given. And the candidate also, you know, the learner kind of had limited reasoning and in making the judgments which were unsupported, basically. The why was missing effectively. So I think you can see that in front of you guys, those, 4 sentences as a response to a possible 12 marks being available here. So if we go on to the next one, Rob, you can, yeah, lovely. So now you can see, I think, the difference. So this particular is an example of a band 4 response. 10 marks out of the possible 12. So, you know, scored well here. And I think you can begin to appreciate and see the differences. So at the beginning, they're talking about and they've identified 3 different aspects. And then they're explaining why by taking each of the aspects in turn. So firstly, about employees' pay, and then secondly, about sick pay, time off, and finally, about employees' entitlement as such. So you can see it's broken down. And I think you would agree there's a significant difference to this response than the previous one, which only got 3 marks. So with this got, when you look at the kind of examiner's commentary, I think it kind of points you in the direction of, for AO2, 3 marks, really. For AO3A, 3 marks, but for AO3B, 4 marks. And I'll explain why as we see with the examiner's commentary. So you can see there that the candidate met the requirements of the question, which obviously is great. He considered at least 3 ERR subjects, which is what he started off with, which was equally good. For each point, he evaluated the importance of the subject and said why it was important, and showed detail and substantial evaluation and judgment, which is why I've said they would have got 3 marks for AO2, 3 marks for AO3A, but for AO3B, then that's where they kind of got the maximum marks. And that's about the comprehension aspect, where the detailed and substantial evaluation took place. So again, if you look at the reasoning why the perhaps didn't get full 12 marks. Well, as it says at the bottom, the candidate remained toward the kind of bottom end of the marking band, really, I suppose, because some of the responses were generic, not tailored to the context of the Ministry of Defence. And that's why it's so important to read the scenarios thoroughly and don't just think, oh, it's ERR, I'll talk about ERR. Actually, it's about, in this case, it was related to the company working with the Ministry of Defence. It needs to be contextualised in that. So hopefully with this particular one, first question, that you've got appreciation of why the marks are allocated for those two kind of responses. Thank you, Rob. If you want to click on to the next one, please, that would be great. So what we thought we'd do, we just put a calculation one in there. So you can see this is to calculate, in other words, to work out, again, definition of the verb, to work out the answer using mathematics. So this is about a pile foundation. You've got the kind of criteria there that you need in terms of the calculations that you need to work with. So what I've shown here is the typical responses that we'd expect to see. So the assessor marking the work we'd expect to see on the left-hand side an acceptable answer. And you can, and I'll not go through this, but clearly you can see the formula there and the number of marks associated with the mathematical outcomes that the learner hopefully will have produced. An important point to note is the examiners will be, the markers will be looking to hopefully see all the workings out by the candidate, by the actual learner. And then you can see that it gives some guidance in terms of for the assessor in terms of being able to look at what kind of marks they can allocate. And in this case, there were 5 marks available, as you can see there. And again, as Rob, just so you've got that on the test spec and the assessment outcome. So it's AO2, and this particular one is related to maths. That's the MC2 reference. Again, you can see the detail of that in a handbook, and it's 7.2 as the kind of learning outcome. But as I said, you can see the guidance given where the assessor will use that in order to be able to allocate. And it talks about 3 marks, it talks about 4 marks, may be applicable if something's been missed out. But if nothing's been missed out and everything's there that should be there, then maximum of 5 marks. And where was this question kind of generated from? Well, it was about the knowledge reference. You've got building technology principles there, and it's under 7.2, the forms of construction. And then particularly on the second line down, you can see substructure, and it's about types of foundations. And then on the far right, that's with the English referencing. Again, the details of that in a handbook. So that's where the kind of questions stem from. You can see the acceptable answer that an assessor would be ideally looking for. You can see the guidance that the assessor has to work with to try and maybe allocate the 5 marks. So if we move on, Rob, please. Thank you. Now you can see the response of the candidate in this particular example. Now, they got the correct answer. The examiner's commentary is particularly useful in this case. It kind of explains why marks have been allocated. This particular candidate got full 5 marks, but you would probably only noticed, when I look at the previous slide, when the examiners, what they was looking for in the response, it's actually a little bit different. It is, and that's fine. And actually, the assessor makes that point on the first one, under mark 1. In other words, he references, says, despite not being the method used in the order outlined in the marking scheme that the assessors themselves are guided by, the candidate was still able to recall and use the appropriate formula of I times pi r squared by the virtue of the fact that they put the figures in the correct manner and in the correct order to be able to do the calculation. So yes, one would normally perhaps expect, as you can see on the mark 1, the formula to maybe be the starting point of the calculation, and I would suggest that's good practice. But a mark can be allocated because while they've not stated the formula, they've actually applied the formula by virtue of the figures, the data, and the processes that they followed in terms of using the numbers. So the learner's not being disadvantaged because they haven't stated the formula. In other words, the assessor's not looking or must see the written formula and then the calculation itself. Okay, so hopefully that will assure you that it is about trying to give as maximum marks as possible for the candidates. And again, you can see another mark allocated because of they recognise that the radius had to be half the diameter, and therefore they are for 600, as you can see again in the calculation. They correctly calculated the area of the circle, so again another mark there, and they multiplied the area of the circle by the height, again another available mark to them. And to conclude, they used the correct SI units, meter cubed, and it was to 2 decimal points. So while the calculation itself was done slightly different to what the examiner has got in their guidance, it actually still resulted in the same outcome. Now, just a couple of points on this. It is important that the learners, the candidates, actually show the working out, because they can get marks for showing the working out, even if the answer they finish up with is wrong. So it is important. Equally, it's important if they are doing some calculation and working through it, and they made a mistake and they don't want that to be factored in, they need to draw a line through it. So it's very clear to the assessor that's forget that was a mistake, just ignore that particular part of the calculation. So just a couple of kind of pointers there. But again, you can see in the examiner's hints and tips, I suppose a couple more things that I've already mentioned about showing the working out. As I said, they don't have to follow the set formula that the assessor is being guided by. It is important the SI units are used, and to do 2 decimal place in this case is used, because that's where marks can be lost. And again, some candidates would forget to kind of round it up to 2 decimal points, and there's a mark potentially lost there, which obviously we don't want. So I think that's quite a useful one in terms it gives you that examiner's commentary for why they've allocated the maximum of 5 marks, even though the calculation is different but correct to that which they are guided by, as you saw in the previous slide. And then you've got some useful examiner's hints and tips. So hopefully, guys, those 2 kind of questions for on-site give you a little bit more practical application, if you like, of what we're kind of discussing today on this particular webinar. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks a lot, Paul. So now I'm just going to run through how some of the support materials might be able to help with support for exams, ESP, etc. So let's just move to the next slide. Sorry, there's a bit of lag on these. I've got a bit of delay today. So we've obviously got the books now live. I'm not going to dwell on that. We've probably told you that in the past on previous webinars. I've put the links there on the slide if you want to purchase books. But we're just going to have a quick look at how the books can maybe help adapt teaching methods to support with exam delivery. So there's a lot of key terms in the book, which gets them used to a lot of the terminology, which might be used in assessment. Obviously, this is on the smart screen stuff as well, potentially, which is free. The books are obviously a purchasable resource. But when we look at this, you've also got industry tips, and even in the one in the middle there, improve your English. It's talking about the luminaire is a word used to describe a source of artificial light. Write a paragraph to explain the use of different types of luminaire in a building and explain why natural light is always a better source of energy. It's getting him used to breaking down that type of question with the support questions in the books. If we look one at the bottom in the middle there, improve your maths. It's research the average wages for 5 different trades in your area. And it's broken down again. Then determine the annual median for the wage. They've got to break down that question. That's actually research. So it's supporting things like the ESP. We look at the one on the right. Search for an online PAS 2032-19 specification of energy efficiency, and then identify standards of PAS 2032-19 for retrofit installers, and explain how they can benefit the construction industry. So by using the, without writing your own resource material, there's some very good little terminology tips and questions which you can use to help learners to break them down, which are included in the Hodder books as well. So there's some great ideas of how to develop the learner skills. You know, use of assessment verbs, questions, also help with setting out sample questions in the classroom. You know, you can reword these. You could maybe use a different British standard or a different terminology or a different maths and English question to help you write maybe some sample questions you can use in the classroom. But what I've also snipped there's also some short answer questions at the back of each section, which you can, again, can help with short answer questions there, as you can see on the left, and long answer questions, which can bring in some different verbs, etc. You've also got little projects in the back of each section as well, which could support, you know, not only exam response questions, but researching things for the ESP. You can get them to maybe write a report to support the ESP. It's all about using these resources to adapt that delivery style within the classroom. So when they walk into that exam, this becomes almost second nature. So now I'm going to hand back to Ali, who's going to have a look at some of the information around the Employer Set Project, ESP.
Thanks, Rob. So good news. I mean, I'm not going to read every single comment out there, but you know, from a general point of view, you can read that. You can see from the feedback from the examiners for the ESP, which is extremely positive. You know, they've obviously demonstrated, presented the work well, and it's obviously a generic response overall. But as the sort of core is compensatory, that means if learners perform better in one area than the other, this will be aggregated. So in this case, the learners who have all performed well in the ESP and maybe not so well in one of the exams in paper 2, this may have been compensatory. However, just worth remembering, the ESP is only weighted at 30% of the core, while the exams are weighted at 70%. So it's just something to consider about time-wise and allocation of resource and teaching. So to maximise the marks that your learners can achieve in the ESP, we've provided some hints and tips based on the results from this year's cohort. So thanks, Rob. Just wait for the next slide. Thank you, that's great. So this slide really is, I'm just using this slide really to show all of the tasks. So, you know, right, what all the 6 tasks are, what each of the AOs are marked against, what the maximum marks are, and what are the weightings of each of the tasks, because that then can help, you know, focus where learners can achieve the highest marks. So, you know, everybody did really well in the evaluation. Unfortunately, it was only 8% of the overall ESP and carried 8 marks, whereas you can see that from 1.2 and 1.3, the report and the plan, you know, has a total, it's weighted at, you know, 50% really, isn't it? So it's 50, yeah, it is, it's 50. So, you know, that's a huge amount of marks there. So, you know, 50% of the marks from the whole of the ESP, because it's out of 100, are weighted on those 2 particular tasks. And you can see where, you know, where there's English, where there's maths, and of course that's where possibly some of those learners lost some of those marks. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, and again, I know I keep going back onto this assessment objective 2, and the reason I keep sort of focusing on this is because you can see it's 54% of the actual marks, you know, 54% of weighting, and because as I say again, it's out of 100, it is 54 marks. It's a huge amount of marks to look at, and if, you know, applying their knowledge and skills and, you know, relevant core knowledge to respond to a brief, you know, look at references to relevant legislation, building controls, materials, concepts. So it's very much about applying that knowledge rather than recall. So I think it is key to sort of keep homing in on that, because everything else they seem to be doing reasonably well, particularly on the AO1. But again, it's only, you know, 14% of the of weighting. So just moving on to what hints and tips I can give you for each of the tasks there. So you've seen these slides before if you have attended all of the planning webinars for exams. But the difference is this time I've just put the task on and then put the, the examiner said, what can you do about it? So I've just, picked out some general comments from the examiners here. So, task 1.1 was the research, and that's the learners using the computer, researching all the notes. So picking out on what the examiner said, he said, or they said, the candidate's research was not always referenced, and in some cases they didn't bother referencing where they sourced that. And if they did use cut and paste, which is perfectly acceptable, and they lifted information from the websites, what the sort of research notes that were evidence ended up with all different font sizes and different sorts of settings and different, so just to sort of make that look more presentable, really, I would suggest for a hint and tip that if they are going to copy and paste any source materials, make sure that it all looks quite nice, so it looks like they've done some research rather than just dumped it on a page. And the other thing really is just get the learners in the habit of copying the website that they're using, so they can just copy and paste that underneath where they have resourced that information. We're not looking for bibliographies or Harvard system of referencing. We're not looking into that detail. It's just, where did you find the information, and there's the source for it, just to cut and paste on that one. So everyone did really well on that. But again, 3 hours, a lot of time, and only 9 marks, because the skill required is more AO1, AO2 rather than anything sort of AO2A, rather than any of the higher order skills. So next slide, please, Rob. This is a report one. Okay, now this is where there's a huge amount of marks, 26 marks on this, predominantly marked across the AO1, AO2 and AO2B. So, critical there that, those assessment objectives, what it is, it's a report for a minimum of 1,500 words. And the examiners said that most of the candidates found this the most challenging task. And what they did was, because they'd used the copy and paste function to get this information in their research, they actually just thought, well, I've written it, I don't need to do any more about it because it's already in that bit. Or they just cut and paste the same information and put it into task 1.2 without tailoring it to meet the requirements of this. And of course, they didn't provide, many candidates didn't justify or just provide a justification for any decisions made. And of course, what they were saying was, even though they actually said a report minimum of 1,500 words, in many cases, the evidence offered was very brief, so therefore didn't meet the 1,500 marks. So, looking at that, coming from a sort of teaching background like yourselves, where in school does it teach learners to write a report? And in general terms, it tends to be in a science investigative writing subject. So it may be that those learners need to go back and say, right, this is how you write a report. And the 4 basic stages are: first of all, you provide an overview, and the overview is just a brief summary about your telling the examiner what the report is about. So it's a paragraph on that. This is an overview of my findings. This is my report. Then the next stage of report is give a background to it. So, the reason I'm doing this report is, and you're setting the scene for the examiner or for the reader. Then you'll go into the discussion, which is also, this is my findings on this report as a result of my research. This is my findings. This is what I've found. And then based on that, you'll finally offer a conclusion. And conclusions just briefly go through the major points that you could draw from the discussion. So in conclusion, this is what we found. This is my suggestion. This is my justification. This is my reasoning. So just to give you a quick hint on the 4 stages of writing a report there, because I'm not convinced it's always covered when those learners get to you. Thanks, Rob. Next one. As I say, I'm not going to focus huge amounts on this because I just want to give you hints and tips here, because overall the ESP performed extremely well. So 1.3 was the project plan. This is, again, 24 marks, huge marks for this one here. So the examiners, it was a program of work and there were supporting statements. So the examiners said that not all candidates produced any type of program of work plan. And hints and tips, really, you know, I've mentioned lot of marks available for the plan. Again, look at the AO2. It's really high on AO2A and AO2B. 16 of those 24 marks are against that. So it's always referring to that there. So, you know, maybe it might be a good idea. You know, you can't provide them with a template. We actually, you know, know that you can't provide them with a template for this. But I think, you know, what you could do is, you know, maybe look at ways of producing a project plan in Gantt charts, you know, type or plans or similar, so they actually know what one should look like if that hasn't already been, you know. Try and sort of get them to look at different types of which would capture the most type of information. Moving on to 1.4. This was the presentation. Again, they had 2.5 hours long and 18 marks for this. So the examiners sort of picked out some of the comments that we've taken overall are that the PowerPoint presentations tended to have more text. So sometimes they'd just been copied a lot of text on a slide, more than what was needed, because obviously PowerPoints are there for bullet points for the rather than provide the information for. They said that some candidates' presentation skills, some of them were quite weak, you know, and the information wasn't relayed effectively. And a really sort of, I suppose, something very similar that is easy to fix is that not all candidates identified themselves at the beginning of the task, which was on the guidance instructions. And of course, we know issues, and this is being talked about at really high level of what we can do to support centres. But the markers also noted that the video evidence uploaded either in some cases didn't play or it had poor sound. So, you know, there are some really quick fixes here. You know, the first one realistically is to, you know, before you submit any evidence of the presentation, just check the quality of the video and to ensure that, you know, you do use a microphone either, you know, next to the person or attached to them, and also make sure that you can capture the voice, that the learner's clear. Suggest learners only use bullet points. There's nothing wrong with them having notes alongside the bullet points on the slides, but you know, the slides themselves shouldn't really have all the information on. And I would either, you know, as a tutor, have a crib sheet there ready, you know, for a checklist. Don't forget, first thing is your name. Make sure you introduce yourself, what subject you're doing, and then make sure you make eye contact, because, you know, with the people, you know, so just some really quick fixes there for you for presentation. Moving on to, I think it's task 2.1. Yeah, this is the collaborative problem solving. You know, 15 marks, quite a lot of marks for only 1.5 hours. So in general terms, the examiners said that, you know, because it was collaborative, they noticed and videoed that some learners failed to engage in it due to, and they hadn't, it was obvious that they hadn't done enough preparation to allow them to engage in this. And again, not all candidates identified themselves at the beginning of the task. So again, really quick hints and tips here. Only look at 3 candidates at a maximum to be observed at this task. So absolutely, I think that is in the guidance, but in some cases there was more than 4 in the evidence that we saw. So only a maximum of 3. Just get them to stick a name badge on themselves. You know, how easy is that to identify them? Just put a name badge on, you know, a separate microphone in the middle, you know, so you could, the candidates in the middle of that group. And I think the key thing here is there is a template provided for the tutors for an observation record. And I think in some cases, you know, they didn't really differentiate between the candidates. And I would suggest only ever use positive language in the observation records and refer to the bands for them. So that's really quick fixes again, you know, just use the template, 3 candidates, microphone, name badges. So they're just easy things to fix. Moving on to the final task here. And this is sorry, it's not the final, I've got one more, this is it, yeah. One of the qualification and assessment development managers provided this for me because obviously I thought this might help. So I asked them for their observations alongside the examiners, and they just said the observation records must be more detailed and contextualized. So we've got prompts in them. There are prompts within those about the language you can use. So please do use those. And obviously, if you know, tutors, go back to the video recording if you need to complete the observation records, because you might have missed something during that. So go back to it. And of course, they've kindly provided some technical advice here, or technical requirements there, which I'm not going to read out because they will be on this slide there. So I'm going to sort of leave that so you can access that, or Rob will put it in a separate email. I think that's already in the guidance, but just to make sure. So on to my final slide anyway for today's session, which is the evaluation. Not too much to say about this because everybody, you know, the candidate said reasonably well by most candidates, so everybody did reasonably well on that. Just to be really picky, not all candidates linked their evaluation to the task and the project brief, and I think most candidates who got the higher marks in this gave a task by task explanation of the word, and I'll just go into that very quickly for you to give you the hint and tip to gain full marks on this one. So if you were setting this out in the evaluation, you know, learners can go off on a tangent. My hint and tip for you would be to get the learners to write down each of the tasks and to do a couple of sentences on each of the tasks underneath it. So task 1.1, what went well, what didn't go so well, what would they do differently next time, or what did they find the hardest, what was easy, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they've learned. So if you just take each task in its entirety and get them to write a couple of sentences, it's highly likely you're going to access the higher marks on that one there. So that's me. I'm going to hand back to Rob now to sort of close the session and see if we can answer any questions. Thanks, Rob.
No problem, Ali. I'm not sure if one of my colleagues, you can actually right click on the link on the slide and drop the link for the survey in the chat, please, while I introduce it. While that's being done, just again to apologise before we're closed around the technical issues we had earlier on. This can't be excused, but unfortunately it happens. You know, we're all presenting from home, and these things, you always get one every now and again, unfortunately, and today is the one. We've run seamless webinars in the past, and I'm sure we will in the future. So apologies if it inconvenienced you with regards to timings, teaching, and other commitments you've got within your academic day. As I said before we started, you will get the recording as part of today, and we are going to actually run the webinar again. Let me just drop this in the chat in case colleagues haven't. Just a moment. Apologies. Just drop that in the chat there. If it'll let me again. Sorry, we're having some major technical issues today. They won't go away, unfortunately, today, but yeah, we've got there eventually. We'll drop that in the chat there now for you. So the purpose of this survey is for you to tell us how today was. Obviously, today's not been great from a technical point of view, but it's also for you to tell us what you want for the future. So, you know, more of this type of thing, or more of support in other areas. What do you need from us with regards to City and Guilds EAL and the support we can provide? So, you know, if we don't mind, we'll have a couple of minutes now. We will be rerunning this webinar because of today's issues. Although you'll get the recording, it will be very similar, obviously. We'll be better prepared and things might run a little bit smoother. But when we advertise that, if you want to encourage any other staff to attend, It might be beneficial, and we will then be sharing the recording for that. You will get the recording for this through GoToWebinar, but potentially this is not going to be the one we put on the website, because we want to run it again, and it'll be a lot more smoother, I'm sure, than it's been today. So if you don't mind just completing the Microsoft forms while we just see if there's any questions in the chat there, in the questions tab, sorry, and then that'll help us improve the service and support you require. It might be whether it's information on books or separate resources. You want to maybe host face-to-face networks. You want to try and get together with other centres. Anything you want to put, we've got to get it all in one place. So we've got to get it in that survey. We can't really just take it from the questions tab, because what we're doing over a number of webinars, we're going to collate all those responses. And then if we maybe have got a host for a face-to-face network, we are going to try and get out to see centres. So also looking to put teaching and learning style events on. We're going to kick off with London and Wakefield. We discussed this yesterday. Got to have a catch up with Ali and colleagues to get that arranged and get that set up. So we're going to be running a lot more face-to-face stuff if we can in the future. Obviously, centres are a little bit sporadic at the moment, but we're going to try and get out there and support you as much as we possibly can. So anything you want, drop it in that survey. We'll give you a couple of minutes just to complete that survey, which you can access if you just drop down box in the chat, and then we'll come back and see if we've got any questions before we close. Thanks a lot, everybody. Appreciate your perseverance today, and again, apologising for the technical issues we've had. Okay, also hopefully you've also all had a chance to click on the survey link. It should only take 2 or 3 minutes to complete. We will leave the webinar running for a minute or two if nobody's had a chance to access that yet. It is important we get feedback on things like this so we can improve in the future. But just from all the team, again, to apologise once again for the late running and technical issues we've had. Hopefully the next one we deliver, we will be sending out an invite to all people who did sign up today, so we can engage with the attendees through GoToWebinar. So if you've attended, great, and you think you've got what you needed from a lot though today, some people might want to listen in again. We will be sending out an invite to the future event through GoToWebinar, as well as sending out an alert through our email alert system and posting on LinkedIn and things like that. We are also, just a heads up before we do close, looking to start some LinkedIn groups up. So if any tutors aren't yet on LinkedIn, that might be another support arm you can use in the future. We're looking to set up some LinkedIn groups for T-levels, basically, specifically for T-levels, to try and bring centres together and enable them to talk to each other. You know, it's like saying we can come to your centre. It might be that you want to arrange to visit another centre who are delivering T-levels and chat and discuss how you're doing things and how you can work together to support each other. So we're looking to build relationships, we're looking to build LinkedIn groups, and we're looking to support you as much as possible. So we'll leave the webinar running for just 1 minute in case anybody else had a chance to access the survey. But thanks a lot, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. And once again, apologies. Thanks a lot.